know that I argue that sectarianism in the late Second Temple period was not the dominant form of Judaism, but rather probably most Jews, especially those living in the diaspora in cosmopolitan areas such as Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria in the north, Rome in Italy, these Jews were not part of a sect. So at least 95% of the Jewish population in the late Second Temple period were not members of a sect. They were probably exposed to many universalist ideas, and by universalist I mean a worldview that invited all of humankind to worship the one true God without converting into Judaism. So I'm not saying that all Jews were universalists, but they probably had exposure to universalist literature and universalist thought. And certainly these Jews living in these cosmopolitan areas were not, for the most part, involved in a sect. However, scholars make the mistake, some scholars, many scholars, make the mistake of characterizing the late Second Temple period as divisive and fractioned and characterized by these pockets of sectarianism that were in conflict with one another. That just is not the reality of Second Temple Judaism. So the majority of Jewish texts that we have are not sectarian. In the very first lecture a few weeks ago, we talked about the Pseudepigrapha, the collection of Jewish books that were written in the late Second Temple period that were not canonized. They're not in the Catholic Bible, the Protestant Bible, the Jewish Bible, but of a religious nature, of a pious nature. And these texts, like the Testament of Abraham or Enoch, 2 Baruch, 4 Ezra, these are not sectarian texts. That doesn't mean that they're all universalist, but they're not sectarian. So what we're going to do today is talk about what is sectarian Judaism, who were these people, and if they really were the tiny minority of the Jewish population in the late Second Temple period, what is important to know about them, and what is their legacy in Rabbinic Judaism. So we're going to do something a little bit different than the first two lectures. We're going to look at the historical evidence as historians. We're going to be very suspicious. In the first 2 weeks, in the first 2 classes, I presented the evidence basically not looking inside. I presented the evidence looking at the primary sources, but we are going to look at ancient writings as secondary sources. So what I mean by that is we're not looking at texts written by sectarian Jews about sectarian Judaism. We're looking at ancient historians telling us about sectarian Judaism, and therefore the question is going to be, what can we really know from these sources? So there are 3 main witnesses, 3 main ancient historians who give us a lot of information about sectarian Jews. One is the late 1st century CE historian Josephus Flavius. He was a Jew who was raised in the land of Israel, witnessed the Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire, which occurred between the years 66 and 70 CE, was assigned to lead a group of Jews, a legion of Jews in the northern area of the land of Israel. His military skill was very, very weak. He lost his soldiers to the Romans. He defected to the Roman Empire, and he moved to Rome. And Josephus ended his days in Italy, in Rome, and that is where he wrote his 2 great works, Antiquities of the Jews, which is a broad rewriting of Jewish history starting from the early biblical period, and where he wrote the Jewish War. He also wrote an autobiography, which actually we're going to look at an excerpt of that autobiography tonight. So Josephus, that's one witness. He gives us a lot of helpful information about these different sects. Another witness to Jewish sectarianism is Philo of Alexandria. Philo is an late 1st century BCE to early 1st century CE, Jewish intellectual living in Alexandria in Egypt. intimately familiar with Greek philosophy. His Greek, he writes in Greek, is incredibly difficult and very sophisticated. He probably did not know Hebrew, but he knows the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, backwards and forwards. A really fascinating thinker that probably the rabbinic community did not know what to do with Philo. He does not make it into the rabbinic canon. But in Philo's mind, he is a very devout and pious and committed Jew who's trying to show his Greco-Roman audience and his Jewish audience that Jewish tradition correlates with Greek philosophy. That is one of Philo's great agendas. But he has some very interesting information about the Essenes, one of the main three sects of late Second Temple Judaism. And our last witness to Jewish sectarianism that we'll discuss tonight is the New Testament. And the issue that we have here as modern readers is that all of these three witnesses to Jewish sectarianism have their own biases. And so what do you do? What do you do when Josephus and Philo are in many ways very apologetic? Apologetic doesn't mean that they're saying, I'm sorry all the time. It means that they're trying to present Judaism in a way that would be very, very appealing to a Greco-Roman audience, and so that might compromise their objectivity. And certainly the New Testament is trying to distinguish Jesus from his Galilean proto-rabbinic environment, and Josephus was immersed, Jesus, that's an important distinction. Jesus was immersed in the world of the Pharisees. We see the Pharisees all over the Gospels. The Gospels are, the ones that are canonized, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So one of the objectives of the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, which is what we're going to look at tonight, although the Pharisees and Sadducees appear in all the Gospels, but what the author of Matthew is particularly interested in is answering the question, what differentiates Jesus from his colleagues who are affiliated with the Pharisaic and the Sadducean sects? So if all these three witnesses have different apologetic agendas, how do we as modern readers figure out what to take from this material as historical evidence? So we're going to look at these sources critically, and we're going to try to find a way. Josephus talks about the three main sects of Judaism in many of his writings. It is very important to him that his readers understand these three sects, and he doesn't necessarily clarify that these sects comprise of a very small population. And you might almost think that to be a Jew, you must be a member of one of these sects. So Josephus is a little bit, well, let's read. Let's find out what he says. Look at the first source is in Antiquities, book 8. And he says, at this time there were three sects among the Jews who had different opinions concerning human actions. And what Josephus is going to tell us here is that there are three main sects: the Pharisees, who we now consider as the proto-rabbinic community, the community of Jews who developed an oral law that complemented the written law of the Hebrew Scriptures. And we have the Essenes. We don't really know. We don't know much about the Essenes except that scholars identified them with the Dead Sea sect, and that will be very important in a few minutes. And the Sadducees. So in this passage, for Josephus, the main distinguishing factor between these groups is their attitude towards free will. So look at the underlined. You do have underlined, right? I'm not sure if okay. Now for the Pharisees, they say that some actions, but not all, are the work of fate. So some things will happen to you in your life that has already been predetermined by God, but not everything. So he puts the Pharisees in the middle of a spectrum, and then on one side he has an extreme group, the Essenes. They affirm that fate governs all things, you don't have any free will. And on the other side, the Sadducees, they take away faith. They say there's no such thing. Everything is free will. So Josephus places the Pharisees in the center as the moderates. So if you were a Jew living in the 1st century CE, or a Roman, or a pagan Roman, would you be able to distinguish a Jew and determine what sect he is a part of just by looking at him? According to this, the distinguishing factor is based on belief. But what would that have meant to a regular person living in the land of Israel or somewhere in the diaspora? Is this a very practical means of differentiation? There's probably more distinguishing these groups than Josephus is telling us in this passage. But it is interesting that the Pharisees in this text are the moderates. Some things are of free will, and some things are predetermined by God. It seems like a simple picture, but it's not, because we're going to see that all of our sources give us different information, and they don't all give us the same. There's overlap, but we don't have any account that that focuses on the same aspect of differentiation between the sects. So it's challenging to figure out what is the main aspect of differentiation. In another section in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, and also in Book 13, he doesn't talk about fate versus free will. He talks about the question of attitude towards written law versus oral law. So that's a totally different category, a theological category, right? And he says, well, what I would now explain is this. The Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers. What does that mean? Outside of written law, right? These are not written in the law of Moses, and for that reason it is that the Sadducees reject them. So here we have a totally new differentiation between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and note that the Essenes are not really in the picture right now, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees over and over, we're going to see in all these witnesses, in all these texts, the Pharisees and the Sadducees engage head-on with one another, because probably they were very similar. They both looked to the Hebrew Scriptures for guidance, but, this is very important, the Sadducees completely rejected the authority of oral law, and for the Pharisees, the oral law was complementary to the written law. And we'll see in a Mishnah, I'm actually not going to do this Mishnah inside, but you can skip to the bottom of page 5, that this is a very interesting, there are actually 2 Mishnayot that I cite here, and there are more in Mishnah Yadayim chapter 4, where we see this engagement with the Sadducees head on. And here we should read the Pharisees as the voice of the proto-rabbinic community, and the Sadducees who totally reject oral law as the outsiders, but still they're engaging with one another in matters of halacha, in matters of law, of Jewish law. So Josephus says, and it is for this reason that the Sadducees reject the Pharisees, right? So now we're not talking about fate, free will. That's very esoteric. That's very sophisticated. But this is very practical, right? Either you keep the laws of Eruv, and the reason why I'm saying Eruv is because Philo of Alexandria talks about, and this is like pre-Mishnah, pre-Talmud, Philo, the 1st century Alexandrian Jew, talks about how certain Jews are very strict about not carrying burdens outside of their cities on Shabbat. So that is not in the Hebrew Bible, but that is a fascinating reference because it is pre-rabbinic. And so Philo, and he died in the mid-30s CE, Philo tells us, this is like a little gem, and I don't have it in the source sheet, but this reference to this idea of not carrying burdens outside of Shabbat is an incredible gem for us because it pushes rabbinic law back into the Second Temple period. And we have other examples of this too, of Philo and Josephus and other Second Temple texts talking about laws that were already mainstream in Pharisaic circles that are not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, but that we know to have been concretized in rabbinic literature. But rabbinic literature, remember, the Mishnah was written in 200 CE, the Talmuds were written in the 4th, 5th, 6th century CE, the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmuds. So what the evidence does is it pushes it all the way back into the Second Temple period. And so we know that there were certain very dominant oral laws being practiced at this time that the Sadducees rejected and the Pharisees claimed were had to be observed. Okay, where were we? The Sadducees reject them and say that we are to esteem those observances to be obligatory, only which are in the written word, meaning in the Bible. And we are not to observe what are derived from the tradition, the oral tradition of our forefathers. The greatest disputation of Sadducean thought is perhaps in the first chapter of Mishnah Avot, where we talk about the very tight reception of Misorah, of tradition that was inherited from generation to generation, right? We work backwards, we work from Moshe, and we go forward generation by generation, and we see the chain of transmission all the way down to the rabbinic community. And this is a polemical demonstration arguing for the authority of the rabbinic community and the oral law that they have developed, because it wasn't written down until the time of the Mishnah. But the Mishnah is arguing this is as ancient and as authoritative as the written law that Moses received on Sinai. So that's an incredibly important argument that chapter is making. And it's an argument against the Sadducees. So far Josephus has given us two categories of differentiation. One, the sects disagree regarding free will. Two, the sects disagree regarding the authority of oral law. And now we have something totally different. Three, we're going to see that the Pharisees are just super popular. Let's look at this. Look at the end of the paragraph. This is not underlined. The Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich, and have not the populace obsequious to them. But the Pharisees have the multitude on their side. Now the question is, as all of us, we're historians reading this in the 21st century, the first question is, well, if Josephus is correct, why? Why is it that the Pharisees were so popular and their lifestyle was so appealing? Now that's not a question necessarily that has one right answer to it, or that I'm going to tackle right now, but think about it. The Pharisees had the multitude on their side. And then he says, but about these two sects and that of these scenes, I've treated accurately in the second book of Jewish Affairs, and we're going to see that's the second book of the Jewish War, which we'll see on page 3. Okay, so now we have three things. Well, they're different regarding predetermination free will. They're different regarding written and oral law. One group is really popular, one isn't. And now we have the question of the immortality of the soul. Turn to page 2. Look at the underlined. The Pharisees believed that the souls have an immortal vigor. And this was, in the ancient world, this was a big topic of conversation. Only the Jews in the late Second Temple period believed in resurrection. And only the Pharisaic Jews probably believed in that the bodies of the dead would return and their flesh would be restored and would once again be reunited with the soul. That was really very, very distinctive to Judaism in the Second Temple period, specifically Pharisaic Judaism. But this idea of the immortality of the soul, you do see it in Greek philosophy. And so look at the Pharisees, the underlined. They also believe that the souls have an immortal vigor in them, and that under the earth there will be rewards or punishments. So after you die, you will be judged for your sins, and your soul is immortal. Now, second paragraph, but the doctrine of the Sadducees is this, that souls die with the bodies, nor do they regard the observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them. So, is there resurrection in the Pentateuch? Is there any reference to life after death? Why do you have to honor your parents, according to Deuteronomy? For a long life, right? The concern of the Hebrew Bible. And right now I'm not talking about the late biblical prophets, because there are perhaps passages in Ezekiel, right, with the dry bones being resurrected. There are passages in late biblical prophetic literature that could be interpreted as the very earliest expressions of concern with life after death and the question of what happens to the soul. But in the first 5 books, certainly, there is no mention of the world to come. Now Yaakov, the patriarch Jacob, talks about going down to Sheol, but that may have been regarded by the ancients as a physical place, just like Hades. The Greeks thought that they would be in a different physical, they would have some sort of different physical existence, but it's not the same thing necessarily as the Gan Eden, or this totally aphysical existence that Pharisees envisioned. So the Sadducees do not believe in resurrection. When the body dies, the soul dies. The soul does not have immortality. The Pharisees disagree. And then we have a paragraph about the Essenes. The Essenes actually, at first blush, look like the Pharisees. The doctrine of the Essenes is this. And by the way, the question, again, as historians, is what do we know about the Essenes? Not all scholars think that that they should be identified as a Dead Sea sect community. So, like the Sadducees, we do not, if they are not to be identified as the Dead Sea sect, we do not have any evidence from them of their own writings. Like the Sadducees, their own writings were not preserved. So their voices are lost, which is why we have to be very careful readers. Because if you want to learn about Catholicism, would you rather learn it from me, Malka Simkovich, or would you rather learn it from a Catholic priest? Right? You'd probably want to learn about Catholicism from someone who totally embodies it, right? Not from an outsider. So we have to be careful here. Okay, so the doctrine of the Essenes is this, that all things are best ascribed to God. They teach the immortality of the souls and esteem that the rewards of righteousness are to be earnestly striven for. And when they send what they have dedicated to God into the temple, they do not offer sacrifices. So this is interesting. I want to go down to. Okay. Go down. I'm trying to think if we. Okay, this is demonstrated. So right before the bold. Oh no, I put that in bold. You don't have that in bold. Do you see this is demonstrated? It's like 5 lines down from the underlined. So they live in commonality with one another, and so that a rich man enjoys no more of his own wealth than he who has nothing at all. So they live in a communal life, a kibbutz-like life, where they live in commonality with one another. There are about 4,000 men that live this way. They don't marry, nor are desirous to keep servants, so it's totally democratic. Everyone is part of the same social caste. And let's see what else. Okay, so basically what he wants to emphasize here is that they live together communally, and it's only a community of men. They do not marry. We're going to see that there are varieties of the Essene sect that Josephus talks about in the Jewish War. There's a lot of information that Josephus gives. Well, I didn't even include all the information that Josephus gives on the Essenes in the Jewish War. But let's put the Essenes on the back burner and look at this 4th sect of Jewish philosophy on the top of page 3. This is striking because earlier in book 13 of Antiquities, Josephus says that there are 3 sects among the Jews, but then he has like a little postscript over here. But there's a 4th sect of Jewish philosophy. And he doesn't always mention this 4th sect. If you just look down quickly, you see Josephus, the Jewish War, book 2. Again, he says there are 3 philosophical sects among the Jews. So we have 2 places where Josephus says there are 3 sects. But then he has, but the 4th sect, it's almost like as he was writing, he's like, I think I'm going to stick this in. This is important. I'm going to call them a sect because my readers need to know about this group as well. So who are these people? And the question is, are they a sect? Are they a movement? What are they? These are the rebels, the Jewish extremists, you might say, who could be identified with the Pharisees, but they were bent on rebelling against Rome, and they did not want to be under any host empire. So not all Pharisees were interested in rebelling against Rome. In fact, we know that many of the rabbis were very against rebelling against Rome. But these Jews, let's read about them. Judas the Galilean was the author. These men agree in all things with the Pharisaic notion. That means presumably regarding free will, some things you have free will, some things are predetermined. There is resurrection. The soul is immortal. So in worldview, they're very similar, but they have an inviolable attachment to liberty. So they have a problem with Judea being a Roman province. And they say that God is to be their only ruler and Lord. So they want autonomy. Look down. So they also do not value dying any kind of death, nor indeed do they heed the deaths of their relationships and friends, nor can any such fear make them call any man Lord. And since this immovable resolution of theirs is well known to a great many, I shall speak no farther about this matter. So these are the people who presumably rebelled against the Romans. They're also known in other texts as the Zealots, the rebels. But why do you think Josephus doesn't want to give more detail? He says, well, they're known to a great many, so I shall speak no farther. Is that really the motivation for Josephus not talking more about these people? You guys already know what I'm talking about. That doesn't stop him from embellishing in other places. Josephus is very loquacious. He gives a lot of detail.
But they were probably fairly unpopular with the Romans.
Incredibly unpopular. And Josephus, is very conscious of his Roman audience. So he took on the name Flavius of a Roman noble family. And by the end of his life, he was not associating with, remember, he defected to the Romans in the war of what's called the Great War, between 66 and 70 CE. He defected to the Romans. So he sees himself as loyal to the Roman Empire. So this is not a topic that makes him comfortable at all, to expound on these Jews who caused the Roman Empire a great deal of tsaris, as we say. So what many people don't know is that the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE was instigated by these Jewish rebellions against Rome. Titus didn't just wake up one day, the Roman emperor, and say, or Vespasian didn't wake up one day and say, it's a good day to burn down the Second Temple, let's invade Jerusalem. There were 4 years of rebellions against Rome, and it's possible that the mentality was, well, in the years 175 to 164 BCE, the Jews thought, it worked for them, right? The Jews who rebelled, the Hasmoneans who rebelled against the Greek Empire, achieved autonomy. So it seems like God was pretty happy with their rebellion because things worked out very well for them. They achieved autonomy between 164 BCE to 63 BCE. So God wants us to work to achieve that autonomy. I'm theorizing right now. But it's very possible that the Jews who rebelled against Rome in 66 CE looked back to the Hasmonean period and said, well, it worked out pretty well for them, let's give it a go. But this time, it was a disaster, right? And I'm not sure if I mentioned this last week or 2 weeks ago, but the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135 CE, so 65 years later, was another attempt to achieve autonomy from Rome. And that was, I would argue, like many other scholars, a bigger disaster than what happened in 70 CE when the temple was destroyed. Because when Bar Kokhba rebelled, the Romans said, that's it, we're done. No more Jews are allowed in Jerusalem. We are banning Jews from Jerusalem. We are renaming Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, which is a Roman name. We are putting a temple to Jupiter, to the god Jupiter, right in the middle, totally recharacterizing Jerusalem. And over 100,000 Jews were killed in 135. But there were these groups probably emerging from within the Pharisaic community because they had the same theology, the same worldview, Josephus tells us. Josephus doesn't want to give too many details. He's not interested in talking about these guys. But from within this Pharisaic world emerged these zealots, these rebels, who brought trouble for the Jews. Now, it could be that Josephus knew from the very beginning he was going to talk about this sect, but he didn't want to say there are 4 sects. He didn't want to legitimize them, perhaps, in the same way as he legitimizes the first 3 groups. In his book, The Jewish War, Josephus also talks about the 3 philosophical sects among the Jews. Here we have lots and lots and lots about the Essenes. And again, we have this emphasis that they all live in commonality with one another. Look at the second paragraph. These men are despisers of riches, and I like this, so very communicative as raises our admiration. That's actually great support that they should be identified with the Dead Sea sect, because the library preserved in the caves of the Dead Sea, do you know what I'm talking about? There are 13 caves in the area of the northwestern edge of the Dead Sea. We have 13 caves in which scrolls were found that probably comprised a library of a 1st century CE group of Jews. And that could have just been the tip of the iceberg. What about all the scrolls that were taken over the years or destroyed or withered. That probably did not even comprise the whole library, but there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fragments of manuscripts that we still have because the air is so arid, so dry, that these scrolls that were put in clay jars were very well preserved, incredibly well preserved, miraculously. It's just amazing. And they're being digitized. The Israel Antiquities Authority is working with Google. Maybe you can go online now and just search Dead Sea Scrolls on Google, and they're putting them all online. Pictures of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So not just the text. It's amazing. Okay. So look at the bottom of the second paragraph. They have no certain city, so they don't live in just one place, but many of them dwell in every city. And if any of their sect comes from other places, what they have lies open for them. Oh, you're in the scene from the north, and you're here in the south. Come, you're welcome, eat with us, stay with us. Just as if it were their own, they go into such as they never knew before. So they have great camaraderie. And then he repeats their doctrine at the end of page 3. The souls are immortal, they continue forever. It's a very poetic little passage, the bottom of page 3. Okay, now go to... I underlined the second paragraph just because it's very interesting and enigmatic and I'm not sure what it means. Did I underline that for you? There are also those among them? This is fascinating because we don't necessarily have evidence of this in the Dead Sea Library. There are also those among them who undertake to foretell things to come. So they fancy themselves as prophets, as diviners. It's very interesting. By reading the holy books and using several sorts of purifications, whatever that means is up for interpretation, and being perpetually conversant in the discourses of the prophets. And it is but seldom that they miss in their predictions. So it is possible, if you're familiar with the Dead Sea text, that there is a genre of text in the Dead Sea Library called the Pisharim, the interpretations, where you would have, let's say, the book of Habakkuk, the prophet Habakkuk, line by line, and then there was a commentary on Habakkuk. We have this, it's in the Dead Sea Library, and you would have one line of Habakkuk, and then the writer would say, this refers to the evil priest who oppressed the community. It's all very hard to interpret because this commentary on Habakkuk does not name any names. So he talks about an evil priest oppressing the community. He talks about a teacher of righteousness who saved the group. And it could be that this idea that the prophets could be interpreted as foretelling contemporaneous events, it could be that that's what Josephus is talking about. But then he says who undertake to foretell things to come. So maybe that's not contemporaneous. Maybe that's the end time. This is a hard passage. So it's possible that he's talking about things like the Pisharim. We don't know. Look at the next paragraph. There is an order. Oh, before I read this, I'm going to preface by problematizing Josephus' statement that Essenes do not marry. One of the biggest issues with that is that the Dead Sea, which is also known as the site of Qumran, the Qumran site, S-I-T-E, has on the edge of it a cemetery. And archaeologists dug up this cemetery and found bodies of men, women, and children. Now we have multiple witnesses, multiple ancient sources that tell us the Essenes never married. And so some scholars said this could not be a community of Essenes because we have bodies of children in the cemetery. But look at Josephus. There's another order of Essenes who agree with the rest as to their way of living and customs and laws, but differ from them to the point of marriage. There's one community of Essenes, or a different order, a minority order of Essenes, who do marry. So it could be that that is the community of Qumran. So there's a lot of information here. We have to sift. We have to be very skeptical and careful with all of this information that we're getting. So they are pro-marriage. They think that by not marrying, they cut off the principal part of the human life, which is the prospect of succession. So having children is so important, so they do marry. All right. And then he parenthetically talks about the Pharisees. We're not going to talk about that. I want to go, because it's already 8:36. I want to look at one more text from Josephus in his autobiography. Autobiographies, especially ancient ones, are always very fun. So I underlined the whole thing because I didn't want to skip any of it. And this is the very beginning of Josephus' autobiography. He basically tells us that he was a prodigy. So again, as modern readers, you have to be very careful. right? If I tell you I'm a prodigy, take it with a grain of salt. Don't. Okay. When I was a child, and about 14 years of age, I was commended by all for the love I had to learning. I'm not trying to make you cynical. I think there are kernels of accuracy in Josephus, but we just have to be careful readers. On which account the high priests and principal men of the city came then frequently to me together in order to know my opinion about the accurate understandings of points of law among us. Points of law, I skipped a line. So he was so well versed in Jewish traditional law, whether this means oral law, probably does, or written law, unclear, but people would come to him and ask him how to interpret the law. And when I was about 16 years old, I had in mind to make trial of the several sects that were among us. So now in each of Josephus' 3 books, The Jewish War, Antiquities of the Jews, and Vita, which he calls life, Vita just means life, his autobiography, he talks about the 3 philosophical sects of Judaism. These sects are 3. The first is that of the Pharisees, the second of the Sadducees, and the third of the Essenes, as we have frequently told you. So he wants to try out all the sects. For I thought that by this means I might choose the best if I were once acquainted with them all. So I contented myself with hard fare, and underwent great difficulties, and went through them all. Nor did I content myself, I have typo, sorry, with these trials only, but when I was informed that one, whose name was Banus, lived in the desert, so now we have an ascetic named Banus, an ascetic meaning an individual who lives by himself and doesn't, only has the minimum of what he needs to live. He doesn't have anything, well, let's read. This person lives in the desert. He uses no other clothing than what grows upon trees. Oh my goodness, that doesn't sound very proper. And had no other food than what grew of its own accord. And he bathed himself in cold water frequently in order to preserve his chastity. We don't need to explain that. I imitated him in those things. So he tried out the 3 sects, and then he joined an ascetic living in the desert, presumably a Jewish ascetic. And he takes on the role of an apprentice to Banus. And he continued with him for 3 years. And when I accomplished my desires, I returned back to the city, being now 19, and I began to conduct myself according to the rules of the sects of the Pharisees. And then he tells his readers, that's akin to the sect of the Stoics, as the Greeks call them. So, nah, not really, Josephus. Yeah. But, middle Stoics, maybe? Why do you think Josephus wants to stick it in? And the Pharisees are like the Stoics. We don't know. What do we know about the Stoics? The immortality of the soul, that there's a universal law, that all of humankind, and also what's interesting about the Stoics is that they're not monotheistic, but they are invested in the idea of one creator God, a Zeus-like God. There are other divine figures, but the Stoics mock those more Homeric depictions of the Greek gods being babyishly fighting with one another. The Stoics believed in one supreme creator God. Yes, there are other divine beings out there, but in some ways the Stoic thought was very appealing to late Second Temple Jewish thinkers like Philo. Philo really draws on Stoic thought. Were the Pharisees imitating the Stoics? That is really quite a stretch. But why is he sticking that in there at the very end? Again, we have to think of his audience right now, right? Yeah.
Probably make the Pharisees sound more appealing.
That's right. And I chose them. So what I was really doing, so he's making a case for his own life choices as a 19-year-old. What I was really doing was taking upon myself a sophisticated Greek strain of thought that's so sophisticated that most Greeks don't even know or aren't intimately familiar with its worldview. Right? Stoic thought was very sophisticated, and I think what he's saying is that my choices as a very young man were to take on these ideas that the great Stoics had. Right? Okay. Let's look at some other sources, and we're gonna up the pace a little bit. This is a long source sheet. All right. The Gospel of Matthew, written in the mid to late 1st century CE. It's the most Jewish of the Gospels, by which I mean that it's of great concern to the writer of this gospel that Jesus was a Jew who was revolutionizing Judaism, but not intending to start a different religion. And so very often what we have in the Gospel of Matthew is Jesus did this and this thing, whatever it was, this wonder, this cure, this miracle, in order to fulfill the prophets Isaiah's words that ... So the writer of the Gospel is always bringing us back to the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Septuagint, the Greek, but the Jewish Scriptures, and saying Jesus was fulfilling the biblical prophets' predictions. But the writer also, as I said in the beginning of the talk, has to distinguish Jesus from the other sects of Judaism. And so there's a scene in Matthew 22 in which the Sadducees come challenging Jesus, and then the Pharisees come to challenge Jesus, and then Jesus does the thing where, like, you're at a carnival and the little alligator heads pop up and you're bopping them down, then another one comes up. No, not a good metaphor. That's how I look at it. I'm going to stop doing that. Okay, so the Sadducees say to him, there's no resurrection. Now that's a real problem for Jesus because he predicts his own resurrection. They ask him a question saying, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now, they're giving him a riddle. They're testing him. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died childless, leaving the widow to his brother. Now remember, do the Sadducees believe in resurrection? No. Josephus is arguing for resurrection. So they say, okay, so there were 7 brothers. The first married and died, leaving the widow to his brother. The second died. Then the third, they kept marrying the same woman. So she ended up marrying 7 brothers. And then the woman herself died. In the resurrection, then, whose wife of the 7 brothers will she be? That's a really hard question for the average Jew. I don't know. Okay, so Jesus says, well, you're wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. It doesn't matter what your status is now in this world. And this is a very hard statement to interpret, by the way, and it could be interpreted in different ways, but let's say the pshat here is that you don't have any sort of comparable status like this after the resurrection. Now you can be married, you can be single. It doesn't impact your status in the post-resurrection world. And yes, there is resurrection. As for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is God not of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astounded at his teaching. So the first thing the writer of Matthew does is he says, okay, here's how Jesus is different from the Sadducees. He believes with great conviction in the resurrection. And how might he be distinguished from the Pharisees? Look at the next couple verses. This is so interesting. Unfortunately, I think I've mentioned this in earlier talks, unfortunately, the Pharisees and Jews in general are subject to a very damaging Christian stereotype that Jews are obsessed with law and with legalism and with halacha, what to do all the time. That Jews sort of lost, they were just a shell of what their religion was meant to be originally, and the Christians saved the covenant by injecting it with ethical concern. And a lot of this stereotype of the Pharisees not caring about any ethical concerns, it comes from the Gospels. When the Pharisees, so in the Gospels, what I mean to say is that the Pharisees are always obsessed with the law. And here, there's no mistake here that the person among the Pharisees who challenges Jesus is a lawyer. Look at verse 34. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Right? We're going to make another alligator head pop up. Boop! Here we are. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, that might be sarcastic. You might think of the tone there. Teacher, but Rebbe, probably Aramaic, Rav. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. Now, many Christians read this and think, oh, this is the revolutionary aspect of Christianity, that they injected the covenant with ethics and love for all of humanity. It wasn't insular. They universalized the covenant for all of humankind, and all could enter into the covenant through belief, through faith, not through works, not through halakha. And then Jesus says, and the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now we know this is a Pharisaic teaching, right? Who says this? Hillel, right? And Hillel is asked, this is a great little interpretation. I really do have to speed up, I apologize. A great little interpretation about when Hillel is asked to give all the Torah, al regel achat, the Majorca Commandment. My professor at Brandeis University, Reuven Kimmelman, professor of rabbinic literature, gave an insight which sometimes you get an insight and you realize that it's just so clearly the pshat. Why did I never think about that? Regel means on one foot in Hebrew, but does that make so much sense? I'm right now, you can't see, but I'm actually standing on one foot. I could do this for 3-5 minutes. Someone more talented could do it for 10 minutes. I could probably give more wisdom than just saying that one sentence that he says. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. But in Latin, regel means law, regulation. So what Hillel is being asked, according to Reuven Kilman, and I think this is so great, what Hillel is being asked is, give the moral theology of all of Pharisaic law in one regulation, in one epithet, in one law. And then the response is, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so it's a Pharisaic teaching, but not in the telling of the Gospel of Matthew. It's sort of co-opted. It's co-opted by the Christians, and the fact is, the Pharisees were very concerned with social. Yeah, does somebody want to say something?
How
Yeah.
do we know who co-opted it from?
Well, first of all, Leviticus 18 talks about you shouldn't do unto a neighbor what you want. I didn't bring my Tanakh, but it's really a citation of Leviticus 18. So perhaps it is more accurate to say that this was an idea that was circulating. Yeah, that might be more accurate to say. This was an axiom that was circulating in first century Pharisaic circles, right? Drawn from biblical precedent, but not the chiddush of Jesus. Okay. The point here is that the Gospel of Matthew is concerned with making a distinction between Jesus and the Sadducees on one hand, Jesus and the Pharisees on the other hand, because this is Jesus' world. Yes, on the one hand, probably the majority of Jews in the late Second Temple period were not members of a sect, but these groups had a dominant, a real serious presence in the land of Israel, particularly in the northern regions in the time of Jesus, so in the Galilee for sure, and Jesus had to contend with them. And the writer of the gospel has to explain what makes Jesus special. Yes?
So if you were a religious leader at this time, would you have to have belonged to one of these sects though?
A religious leader living in Alexandria? I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that the presence of sectarian Jews was, for the most part, I don't like making geographical boundaries, but for the most part, in the land of Israel. But again, does that mean that the majority of Jews living in the land of Israel were members of a sect? No, it doesn't. Okay, I just want to skip to, I want you to scan, because we're short on time, we're not going to do the Mishnah, but I want you to scan pages 6 and 7, because Philo goes on and on and on about the Essenes and how awesome they are. The Essenes are so great. Look at the top of page 7 at the end of the first paragraph. They each day have a common life and a common table. Like Josephus told us, they live like a kibbutz. They share everything. There's no hierarchy. They are content with the same conditions, lovers of frugality, who shun expensive luxury as a disease of both body and soul. They're not materialistic. They live in harmony among one another. Look at the third paragraph. Furthermore, they eschew marriage because they clearly discern it to be the soul. I mean, Philo's really anti-women. It makes me uncomfortable sometimes. I'll read this. Sure, it's entertaining. Because they clearly discern it to be the soul or the principal danger to the maintenance of the communal life. Look, skip a line. For no Essene takes a wife because a wife is a selfish creature. I'm going to say this quickly. Excessively jealous and an adept at beguiling the morals of her husband and seducing him by her continued impostures. All right, we don't need to. We don't. Okay, because it doesn't matter. Philo goes on and on about the Essenes in a very complimentary way. Actually, look at the end. Such then is the life of the Essenes, a life so highly to be prized, that not only commoners but also great kings look upon them with admiration and amazement, and the approbation and honors which they give add further veneration to their venerable name. Now, again, we have to be modern historians. Is Philo exaggerating, or were the Essenes really legendary? Were they legendary in the ancient world for their great piety, for their virtue, for the way that they treated one another, for the way that they lived communally and not materialistically, for the success of how they worked together without putting some sort of social hierarchy into place? Were they really known for that? So maybe the answer is yes. We have a first century Roman historian, Pliny the Elder, who is a contemporary of Josephus, but a little bit younger. So Pliny dies in the 70 CE, which means that it's very likely that Josephus had Pliny. Josephus was aware of Pliny and his writings. They're almost exactly contemporaries. And Pliny talks about the Essenes in a fascinating way, and this might be a clue if it is indeed reflective of the fact that Romans, Gentile Romans, were aware of the Essenes, considered them to be legendarily virtuous. It might explain why Josephus capitalizes on that good reputation to say, yeah, they're one of us. And Philo does the same thing. So look at what Pliny says. Now this is in Greek. This is hard. Some of these transliterations are tricky. Lying on the west of the asphalt heights and sufficiently distant to escape its noxious exhalations are the Esseni, a people that live apart from the world and marvelous beyond all others throughout the whole earth, for they have no women among them. All right, we don't. Okay. To sexual desire, they are strangers. But again, this does affirm that they live. Remember, Josephus says there's a few Essenes who do marry, but it seems that the majority do not. Money they have none. They live communally. The palm trees are their only companions. He's really waxing poetic. Day after day, however, their numbers are fully recruited. So they're growing because people desperately want to be part of this community by multitudes of strangers that resort to them, driven thither to adopt their usages by the tempests of fortune and wearied with the miseries of life. Thus it is that through thousands of ages, okay, this we can take with a grain of salt, incredible to relate. This is Pliny, a Roman. Incredible to relate. This people eternally prolongs its existence without a single birth taking place there. He doesn't know that there are Essenes, according to Josephus, who do marry. He has heard of them. Pliny, it doesn't seem like he's actually been to their community. It seems like they're legendary and he's writing about them. And does he say that they're Jewish? Does he know that they're Jewish? Maybe not. Maybe not. Okay. We'll take a deep breath. All right. So, if it is true that the Essenes they were of great repute in the first century, so much so that a Roman historian is writing about them as if they're legendary and they've been around for thousands of years, then this might explain why they get so much face time in Josephus and Philo, but it doesn't mean that they had tens and tens of thousands of members. I want to close with a reference to a minor sect. So we talked about the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and we talked about the the Zealots, right, who were sort of part of the group of Pharisees. And we also have the Hasidim, the Hasidians. And we don't know much about these people, but they're mentioned in both 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees, books that were written in the late 2nd century BCE. Both of these books retell the story of the Hasmonean rebellion, the story of Hanukkah, between the years 175 and 164 BCE, but they don't give the exact same account of who the Hasidim are. So the writers know that there were Hasidim, that they have an important part of the story. In 1 Maccabees, the Hasidim are they're a trusting group of Jews who make a pact make some sort of treaty with the Greeks, and then the Greeks kill them. And I don't have the whole passage here, but they're killed on Shabbat. They won't pick up weapons. On Shabbat, they won't defend themselves. And then Judah the Maccabee says, we are going to pick up arms on the Sabbath. And that is basically the decision that wins them the war. Without that, they could not have won. Now, 1 Maccabees was written by a Jew living in Jerusalem who probably worked for the Hasmonean dynasty. He's definitely an insider. His geographic information regarding the land of Israel is very accurate. 2 Maccabees was probably written by someone living either in Antioch in Syria or in Alexandria as a condensation of a longer work by someone named Jason of Cyrene. But 2 Maccabees is definitely written by a diasporan Jew. And here, just look at the very top, page 9, the Hasidians are referenced as the group which is led by Judas Maccabeus. And they're keeping up war and stirring up sedition, and they will not let the kingdom attain tranquility. So it doesn't seem to be that the writer of 2 Maccabees necessarily has the same or the correct information about who these people were, and we know very, very little about them. Probably the information in 1 Maccabees should be taken more as historically accurate, that these were a group of very, very pious Jews who would not defend themselves on the Sabbath, but beyond that we know very little. So we have these groups of Jews, these sects, in the late Second Temple period. But by the time, now this is the most important point, so I'm sorry, thank you for your patience, because I know that it's almost 9 o'clock. So I'm going to wrap up. What was it about the Pharisees that made them, that they won the day, that they stood the test of time, and they emerged as the rabbinic community after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, but we never heard from the Sadducees again, or the Pharisees, or the Zealots, or the Hasidians, the Hasidim. So what about the Pharisees made them a lasting community? First of all, the Sadducees are identified as the priests who were administering in the Jerusalem temple. Once the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees were out of a job. They were elite. Remember, Josephus tells us that they don't have the support of the population. They're running the show. They're administering in the Jerusalem temple. But once the temple was gone, the Sadducean role, that social hierarchy in which the priests were at the top, collapsed. And so once the Sadduceans were out of a job, the Pharisees, whose emphasis on text and scripture and tradition, emerged into a mainstream social position. Judaism became not a religion that encouraged devotion to God through temple service, but encouraged devotion to God through the study of text. And that correlates, this emphasis on text, on scripture, on tradition, both orally and written. This is the contribution of the Pharisaic community. So when we think of the Pharisees and how they emerged, they're the proto-rabbinic community, it's important to know, however, that they, although by the 3rd or 4th or 5th century, rabbinic Judaism became the dominant form of normative traditional Judaism, that was not always the case. And yes, like I said last week, the late Second Temple period should not be identified as a sectarian time. There were what scholars call the characteristics of common Judaism. So if you identified as a Jew, you kept dietary law, you practiced circumcision, and you kept Shabbat. Those were the big 3. And those categories of law were highly, highly developed by the Pharisees, by the rabbis, and ultimately became the dominant form of traditional Judaism. So thank you for your patience, and I'd be glad to take any questions, but I won't take it personally if you need to leave. Yes?
In Jerusalem itself, would you say that the majority of the people were not sectarians? It's
very hard to know, but certainly in terms of the social hierarchy, the Sadduceans were running the show. They were the priests who were in charge of the temple, and they were directly engaging with Pharisees who were living in Jerusalem, but scholars do not know what the percentages are. But that's a very important question. But probably the Pharisees comprised of a few thousand Jews in the 2nd century and the 1st century BC, and then grew exponentially by the 1st century CE. Yes?
What ended up happening to the Essenes?
Well, if they are the community of the Dead Sea sect, so they were gone. They were probably killed by the Romans in the rebellion in the year 70. or they are gone by the end of the 1st century. We know that from archaeological evidence, that there's nothing much there past the 1st century CE. If they are not, so remember that the cemetery there has children in it. So if you're going to say, well, what about all these scenes? Remember, one of the sources say, well, they live all over the place, right? They don't have just one location. So then you might say, well, look, they were celibate. They did not marry. And that just was not going to stand the test of time, despite Pliny the Elder saying for thousands of years people have been begging to be in a scene. That just wasn't the reality on the ground. Yeah, please.
You finished with the big three. What about the group that was called Yirei Hashem?
Right. So there were God-fearers in the Second Temple period. These were non-Jews who adopted certain aspects of Judaism. We know about these from Roman historians like Juvenal talks about Romans who were keeping Shabbat, right? But they were not Jews. And we know from also Jewish sources, Josephus talks about the God-fearers. I do not think that these people were a movement. I think that there were people all over the Greco-Roman world who found Judaism to be very appealing. And in different ways, there was no one particular way to become a God-fearer, but in different ways took on practices of the Jews. So I don't know that that was a sect, but certainly the idea that there were God-fearers as early as the 2nd century BCE it's fascinating, and there were probably thousands of these Greeks and then later Romans who were keeping Shabbat or in some other way identifying, and we have inscriptional evidence of this, that there are some inscriptions on ancient synagogues that talk about the different benefactors of the synagogue. This person, Yerucham ben, not Yerucham, but think of something more traditional, I don't know, Hillel ben something paid for the synagogue, and then these and these people also paid for the synagogue, and the God-fearer so-and-so. So we have inscriptional evidence thanking the support of God-fearers. Most of that inscriptional evidence is actually late 2nd or 3rd century CE. So the question is, what conclusions can you make about what was going on earlier? As I said, they were definitely there, but I don't think that they were a sect living amongst themselves, separate from the rest of the Jewish or Greco-Roman world. But they were definitely very, very important. Yes?
Do you have any indication as to whether there was a void and how some new ideas burst into the scene? Because something preceded something else.
Right. Why did Judaism give rise to these sectarian groups?
Who was there before?
Right.
What existed before everybody?
Yeah, exactly. So the scholar who's really written on this the most is Albert Baumgarten at Hebrew University. He's retired, but if you just Google his writings, Baumgarten, Albert Baumgarten, and he asks the question, what was the socio-cultural, what was happening at the beginning of the 2nd century BCE that gave rise to all these, because we think that is when these sects were founded. We don't have evidence of early Second Temple period sectarian Judaism. So all of our texts, all of our sources are really late Second Temple, starting from the 2nd century BC through the 1st century CE. So what was happening in the 2nd century BCE? So one possibility is that it was a very, very unstable time. I think I talked about last week how after Alexander the Great's kingdom was divided into 3 parts in 333 BCE. The land of Israel was right in the middle. So it was a very unstable region because the Ptolemies were ruling Egypt, the Seleucids were ruling Asia, and the Antiochids were ruling the north, and everybody wanted Israel because it was a great trade route and it had the Mediterranean Sea. So for many years, the land of Israel was Antiochid, and then it was Ptolemaic, and then it was Antiochid, and then it was Ptolemaic. And in this world of incredible lack of certainty, that definitely correlates with a rise in messianic thought, that all this instability has to be for a reason. We're on the cusp of the messianic period, and that might have some sort of relationship with this idea of sectarianism. We are going to become insular and separate ourselves from the outside world, and we are the true Israel. That's one theory. And as a true Israel, if we live our lives together in commonality and do this, adhere to this certain set of rules, we will bring we will be responsible for the transition into the eschatological, into the Messianic age. But scholars are not sure. But Albert Baumgarten is surer than me, so read his scholarship. Yes, please.
So we talked about how the Pharisees are sort of the precursors to rabbinic Judaism, but at this time period, the vast majority, but the majority of Jews still lived in the diaspora, not in, or at least a huge population.
A huge population, certainly.
And so then the Jews who left, when they were expelled by the Romans, they went and they joined other communities that were already in the diaspora.
Well, they joined Jewish communities.
Right.
They still, yeah, right.
Those communities already were in existence.
Right.
So when we're saying that, like, I guess I'm not 100% understanding the explanation for why the Pharisees became dominant when it's not like everyone was starting new,
Right.
everyone was going to a new place. And so how is it that the Pharisees sort of asserted their form of Judaism over the communities that were already extant?
Well, I think it took centuries. The codification of Jewish law, the Mishnah, was probably the biggest contribution of the Pharisees. That until that point, Jewish law had not been written down and categorized in a very accessible way. Probably the Mishnah was originally written as a textbook for students of Pharisaic law, but it was copied and circulated and at some point reached these outer communities. Now, rabbinic Judaism really isn't, like you're saying, the Judaism of the entire world of Jewish life at the late Second Temple period, but remember Babylonia. Because when the Jews were exiled centuries before, right, in 587 BCE, the Jews who were sent to Babylonia, many of them did not return back to the land of Israel, and the Jews who stayed through that Second Temple period, those were the Jews who, and some moved back to Babylonia, who developed this very, very, very rich interpretation of Jewish law that was culminated in the tradition that we now see in the Babylonian Talmud. So, you're right. You're right. I think that the Jews living in all these pockets of the diasporan world were not looking back to the Pharisees living in the land of Israel, at least not in the 1st century BCE, and imitating them. But there were still very well-known aspects of Jewish practice: circumcision, Shabbat, and dietary law. And we don't know how these categories of law were kept, but probably there was some sort of orally transmitted tradition that extends beyond what you could find in the Hebrew Bible, right? I mean, the fact that Philo of Alexandria is talking about Eruv, or he's talking about the rules of carrying and not carrying burdens and where can you carry them in the early 1st century CE, and he's writing in Egypt, means that these traditions were being shared and were traveling. So
I guess when, like, in Babylonia, is that the Pharisees themselves went to Babylonia, or the Mishnah came to Babylonia eventually, and then the people who were there?
That's a really good question. The Mishnah come to Babylonia? Or could you say that the Jews living in Babylonia in the Second Temple period were Pharisees? No, but at some point these communities converged into rabbinic Judaism. Yeah, it's messy, right? You can't make these linear equations, right? The Jews in the land of Israel were this, were X. The Jews outside were Y. It's very tricky, and changes are slippery. Yes.
So if we say that the majority of the Jews in the diaspora didn't fall into one of these three categories,
Probably not. Yeah.
And I missed your previous lectures, and I apologize, but I've heard statistics that say at some point during the Roman world, up to maybe 10% of the entire Roman Empire was Jewish. So if anything like that is even the case, how are these people living their lives that was different from, let's say, the Pharisees in Israel?
How are the Jews in the diaspora living their lives?
Yeah, I mean, you list these big three that everyone keeps, but like, what else? Like, are we talking like just more minute areas of the commandments that differentiated Israel life versus the diaspora keeping of?
We do know very, very little, but the communities that we know the most about are the Jews living in Egypt, not just in Alexandria, but also in Elephantine and Leontopolis, where they built temples to the Jewish God. So this is a mind-boggling thing, that there were Jewish temples, popular temples, that were in Egypt and were in use for centuries. So
temple for their sacrifice.
With sacrifices. And there's a Mishnah discussing if you promise to give a vow at the Temple of the Antipolis, is it better? This is such a great Mishnah. Is it better to do the avera of breaking your vow and then piously not bringing the sacrifice at the Antipolis, because the Mishnah does not like the Antipolis? There's only one Jerusalem temple. Or should you keep your vow and then do the sin of not breaking a vow, but of bringing a sacrifice at the Antipolis? It's very rabbinic, but the Mishnah makes reference to this. It's known as the Temple of Ananias, Beit Chonya. So we know about this also from extra rabbinic, from other non-rabbinic sources. Regarding the question of 10%, we really don't know. But I think I mentioned a few weeks ago that Philo talks about how there are different regions of Alexandria, and each region was assigned a letter of the Greek alphabet, and the Jews were Delta. They were section D. So already you know, and some scholars estimate that there were 1 million Jews in Alexandria. So Alexandria was a massive, it was the New York City of, for sure, the Ptolemaic Empire, maybe even more, more intellectually progressive than Rome was in the 1st century BC. So the question of what they were doing, Philo gives us some information, but it's cloudy. But we do for sure know that, that, as I said, those big three identified you as a Jew. And that's why the God-fears, in order to identify with Judaism, took on those three things. And then the ins and outs, so you have little nuggets of information, like Philo talking about, carrying Shabbat. You have these little, very interesting nuggets, but to put a picture together is very hard. And also, how do you use these sources? Can I say, well, because Philo talks about it, then everybody was observing these laws about carrying burdens outside. What do you do with those little nuggets of those little references? So these are the questions that scholars are asking. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.